The Galactic Concord gathered on the moon of Xylos Prime, a place chosen for its neutrality and silence. 212 species sat in the Great Chamber, each represented by their highest counselors, envoys, or warlords. The air hummed with translator drones and the low murmur of voices speaking in dozens of languages. At the center of it all floated a single glowing orb, the voting sphere. It would soon decide the fate of a small blue planet called Earth. For years, the Conquered had watched humanity. They saw wars fought over lines on maps, cities rising from rubble, songs written in grief, and rockets launched toward stars they barely understood. To many, humans were chaotic, emotional, and dangerous. They built weapons faster than they built peace. They destroyed forests and then planted trees with tears in their eyes. They were unpredictable, and in the eyes of the Concord, unpredictability was a threat to galactic order. The proposal on the table was simple. Earth would not be destroyed. Instead, it would be placed under managed stewardship. Every human would be registered, assigned work, and integrated into the Concord's labor system. Their governments would be dissolved, their militaries disarmed, their children taught the ways of the greater galaxy, not as equals, but as servants. It was called the Earth Compliance Mandate, and it required a unanimous vote to pass. One by one, species cast their approval. The Vrathi, tall and armored, clicked their mandibles in agreement. The Zenthari, beings of living crystal, chimed their consent through harmonic resonance. Even the gentle Kelu, who rarely supported force, voted yes. They believed humanity needed guidance before it destroyed itself or others. No species abstained. No voice rose in defense. Earth had no seat at the table. It had never been invited. Back on Earth, the news came not with explosions, but with a broadcast. Every screen, every radio, every public terminal lit up at once. A calm, synthesized voice spoke in every major language. By decree of the Galactic Concord, effective immediately, Earth is under provisional stewardship. All human activity is subject to compliance protocols. Resistance will be met with non-lethal containment. Panic erupted in some places. In others, there was only silence. In Denver, Colorado, Kyle Dawson stood on his apartment balcony, watching smoke rise from a nearby protest that had already been shut down by hovering drones. He was 34, with tired eyes and calloused hands from years of fixing orbital thrusters before the aerospace industry collapsed under global sanctions. Now he taught kids how to build solar chargers from scrap. He didn't feel fear. He felt something colder, disbelief. How could the entire galaxy look at Earth and see only a problem to be managed? In Austin, Texas, Lena Ruiz sat in her small office at the University of Texas, staring at a wall of alien linguistic data. She had spent the last 5 years decoding fragments of Vrathi communication, trying to understand their culture through syntax and metaphor. She knew they valued order above all else. To them, chaos was a disease, and humanity, with its messy art, its contradictory laws, its constant arguing and rebuilding, was the ultimate infection. She closed her laptop. If they saw humans as broken, then maybe the only way to survive was to break their expectations. Across the world, governments tried to respond. The United Nations issued a statement of protest, but it was ignored. Military bases powered up old defense grids, only to find their satellites disabled by silent pulses from orbit. Within hours, Earth's digital infrastructure was locked down. Banks froze. Power grids flickered under remote control. Yet something strange happened. People didn't riot in the streets for long. They went home. They turned off their devices. They started talking to each other, face to face, in parks, in basements, in churches, and community centers. Kyle walked through his neighborhood the next morning. The streets were quiet, but not empty. Neighbors shared food. Mechanics worked on bicycles instead of cars. Someone had strung up a clothesline between 2 oak trees. It felt like the world had taken a breath. He stopped by a community garden where a group of teenagers were planting beans in repurposed buckets. One of them handed him a tomato. "We're not waiting for them to feed us," the kid said. Kyle nodded. That was the first spark. Lena, meanwhile, began writing. Not reports or academic papers, but short messages. Simple phrases in Vrathi syntax that sounded like compliance logs but carried hidden meanings. Unit 47 reports stable output could also mean, "They are watching us." She sent these through old emergency broadcast channels the aliens hadn't bothered to monitor. assuming humans would rely only on high-tech networks. She was betting that the Concorde underestimated human stubbornness and human memory. The Concorde ships began descending a week later. Massive obsidian-colored vessels drifted over cities like storm clouds. From them came drones, smooth, silent machines that scanned every person, recorded every movement. The Vrathi enforcers landed in armored pods, their exoskeletons gleaming under the sun. They expected fear. They expected surrender. What they found was something else entirely. People looked at them, then looked away. Workers clocked out early. Trains stopped running on schedule. Water pumps were accidentally misaligned. No one shouted. No one attacked. But nothing worked the way it was supposed to. The Conquered had planned for rebellion. They hadn't planned for indifference. Kyle organized a meeting in an old subway tunnel beneath Denver. 20 people showed up, teachers, nurses, electricians, a retired pilot. They spoke in whispers, using hand signals for certain words. They agreed on one rule: no violence unless absolutely necessary. Their goal wasn't to win a war. It was to make Earth ungovernable. If the Concorde wanted slaves, they would find only ghosts. Lena sent her first real message that night. Buried in a fake maintenance log, she wrote, "Compliance is surface. Depth remains ours." It traveled through a network of ham radio operators who hadn't used their gear in decades. Within hours, it reached 3 continents. People understood. They always had. The Conquered assumed humanity would break quickly. They had seen it happen to other species. Once control was established, resistance faded within weeks. But Earth was different. Its people had spent centuries fighting each other, surviving plagues, rebuilding after disasters. They knew how to endure. And now, for the first time in history, they weren't fighting each other. They were fighting for something shared. As the first month of occupation passed, the Vrathi grew frustrated. Productivity reports showed sharp declines. Human workers followed orders too literally, creating bottlenecks and errors. Machines broke down in ways that made no sense. Food distribution systems malfunctioned, leaving alien overseers hungry while humans shared meals in hidden courtyards. Kyle watched a Vrathi officer try to command a group of street cleaners in Denver. The humans nodded, picked up their brooms, and swept the same patch of sidewalk for 6 hours. The officer finally gave up and walked away. Kyle almost smiled. They were learning. Lena received a coded reply from someone in Jakarta. It was just 2 words. "We remember." She knew what it meant. Humanity remembered how to be human, even when the galaxy tried to erase it. The Concorde had voted to enslave Earth. They thought it would be easy. They were wrong. And the real resistance had only just begun. The Conquered ships hung in the sky like dark clouds that never moved. Their presence was meant to be a reminder. Earth was no longer its own. The Vrathi walked the streets in pairs, their chitinous armor clicking softly with each step. They carried no visible weapons, but their drones hovered nearby, scanning, recording, correcting. Humans were told where to go, what to do, and when to stop. Yet something was wrong. The humans were not breaking. At first, the Concorde assumed it was fear. Silence often followed conquest. But weeks passed, then months, and the silence did not fade. Instead, it deepened. Factories that once hummed with activity now stood still, not because they were destroyed, but because no one turned them on. Power grids flickered not from sabotage, but from workers rerouting lines into loops that led nowhere. Trains sat idle on tracks, their schedules ignored. When asked why, humans gave polite, exact answers. The system requires maintenance. The authorization code expired. We are awaiting updated directives. Every reply was technically true. Every reply caused delay. Kyle Dawson moved through Denver like a shadow. He no longer wore his old engineer's badge. Now he carried a satchel of tools, a notebook filled with hand-drawn maps, and a small radio wrapped in cloth. He met people in laundromats, in grocery lines, in the back rooms of shuttered bookstores. No one spoke loudly. No one used names. They used roles. The baker, the nurse, the driver. Trust was earned in glances, not words. He taught them how to disable tracking chips without triggering alarms, how to build Faraday cages from chicken wire and old microwaves, how to send messages using reflected sunlight off broken mirrors. It was slow work, but it spread. In Chicago, a group rerouted sewage pumps to flood a Vrathi supply depot. In Nairobi, farmers planted crops in patterns that confused aerial scanners. In Mumbai, street artists painted murals that, when viewed from above, formed coordinates for hidden supply caches. None of it looked like war. That was the point. Lena Ruiz stayed in Austin, but her voice traveled farther than ever. She had discovered that the Vrathi language relied heavily on harmonic precision. A single off-tone syllable could change a command into a question. She began crafting false compliance reports filled with subtle dissonance. To human ears, they sounded like static. To Vrathi minds, they caused confusion, brief but enough to delay decisions. She sent these through old emergency broadcast towers, the kind powered by hand cranks and car batteries. The conquered never bothered to jam them. They assumed no one would use such outdated tech. One evening, Lena received a message from a ham operator in Oslo. It was short. "They think we are broken. We are just quiet." She smiled. That was the heart of it. The Concord expected rebellion to be loud. Explosions, gunfire, speeches. But humanity had learned, through centuries of hardship, that sometimes the strongest resistance is the one no one sees coming. The Vrathi grew uneasy. Their reports to the Concord High Council showed rising inefficiency. Human labor output dropped by 40%. Machines failed at odd intervals. Even simple tasks like sorting food rations or cleaning streets took twice as long. The Vrathi blamed incompetence. They did not consider that the incompetence was deliberate. In response, the Concord tightened control. Curfews were enforced. Movement between cities required permits. All digital communication was routed through central filters. But the humans adapted faster. They returned to paper, to chalkboards, to memory. Children memorized lists of safe houses. Elders taught Morse code using tapping spoons. In rural towns, people used smoke signals disguised as cooking fires. The Conquered watched the skies, but they did not watch the ground. Kyle organized a network of runners, mostly teenagers who knew the alleys and rooftops better than any drone. They carried messages in hollowed-out shoes or sewn into jacket linings. One girl, barely 16, delivered a map of drone patrol routes from Denver to Salt Lake City by riding a stolen bicycle for 3 nights straight. She never spoke to the recipient. She left the map under a loose floorboard in a bus station and vanished into the crowd. Lena, meanwhile, studied the Zenthari. They were crystalline beings who communicated through light pulses and resonant frequencies. Unlike the Vrathi, they rarely came to Earth's surface, but their ships orbited high above, managing data streams and energy distribution. Lena realized their language had no word for lie. They assumed all signals were truthful. So she began sending fake energy readings, showing power surges where there were none, blackouts where grids were stable. The Zenthari ships adjusted their orbits to compensate, wasting fuel and creating blind spots. The Conquered noticed anomalies but could not explain them. Their systems showed Earth as compliant, yet nothing functioned as it should. Frustration turned to suspicion. They began pulling Vrathi squads off the streets and replacing them with automated enforcers. Tall, faceless machines that followed protocols without question. But machines could be tricked. A group in Detroit reprogrammed a street cleaner bot to spray oil on enforcer patrol paths. In Seoul, hackers used old gaming consoles to mimic control signals and send enforcers on endless loops around empty parks. Kyle watched one such enforcer walk in circles for 12 hours before its battery died. He didn't laugh. He felt something deeper, pride, not in destruction but in cleverness, in the quiet refusal to be erased. Lena received word that the Concord was considering a full neural scan of the human population. They wanted to map human thought patterns, find the source of the resistance. If they succeeded, every hidden network, every coded message, every safe house would be exposed. She knew they had to act fast. She wrote a new broadcast, not in Vrathi or Zenthari, but in a hybrid code only humans would recognize. Buried in weather reports and fake supply logs, she embedded a single instruction. Go dark. For 7 days. No signals. No patterns. Just silence. The message spread. Radios went quiet. Smoke signals stopped. Even the runners paused. For 1 week, Earth became truly still. The Conquered panicked. Without data, they were blind. Ships hovered lower, scanning desperately. Enforcers patrolled empty streets, but there was nothing to find. Humans stayed indoors. They spoke in whispers. They played board games by candlelight. They waited. On the 7th night, Kyle stood on his balcony again. The sky was clear, no drones. No ships hovering low, just stars. He thought of his father, who had taught him to fix engines with duct tape and hope. He thought of the girl who rode the bicycle through the night. He thought of Lena, somewhere in Texas, listening to the silence. The conquered had come to enslave Earth. They brought order, control, and certainty. But humanity gave them chaos. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that endures. The kind that hides in plain sight. The kind that waits. And as the first light of dawn touched the mountains, Kyle knew the real work was just beginning. Months passed after the conquered left. Earth healed slowly. Cities patched their broken windows. Farms replanted fields that had gone fallow. Children went back to school, though the lessons now included how to build radios from scrap and how to read the stars without satellites. Life returned, but it was different. People spoke more, trusted more, shared more. The occupation had stripped away illusions, and what remained was raw, real, and human. Then the signals began. At first, they were faint. Distress calls picked up by old deep space antennas in Australia and Chile. The voices were alien, desperate, and confused. A Vrathi freighter reported its crew losing coherence near the outer rim. A Xanthari science vessel sent a harmonic pulse that collapsed halfway through, as if the sender had forgotten how to finish a thought. Then came the Kelu, a gentle species that had once voted so easily for Earth's enslavement, now begging for medical aid. Their young were failing to bond with their hive mind. They called it the silent sickness. Kyle heard the first full message while fixing a water pump in Denver. Lena had rigged an old satellite dish to catch long-range comms. She played it over a crackling speaker. This is Envoy Corps of the Vrathi Consulate. We request assistance. Our systems are unstable. Our minds drift. We remember your field. We do not ask for it again. We ask for your help to undo what it revealed. Lena looked at Kyle. He didn't speak. He just nodded. The truth was spreading across the galaxy like a quiet tide. Without Earth's chaos to push against, without the constant friction of human unpredictability, many species found their own societies unraveling. The Vrathi, who had built their culture on rigid order, discovered that order without challenge bred stagnation and then collapse. The Xanthari, whose thoughts relied on perfect resonance, began fracturing when their harmonies met no dissonance to balance them. Even the Kelu, who thrived on collective calm, realized their peace had been hollow, built on ignoring problems, not solving them. One by one, they returned. Not with warships, but with small, unarmed vessels. They came to Earth not as conquerors, but as petitioners. The first to land was a Xanthari craft no bigger than a bus. It touched down in the Nevada desert. From it stepped 3 crystalline beings, their light dimmed, their movements slow. They carried no weapons, only data crystals filled with broken equations and failed star charts. They asked for Eli Grant. Eli met them at the edge of the landing zone, wearing the same worn jacket as always. Through a translator, the lead Xanthari said, "Your resonance did not harm us. It showed us our weakness. We cannot think alone. We need your noise to find balance." Eli listened. Then he said, "I won't give you the field, but I'll show you how to build your own resilience. If you're willing to learn." They agreed. Next came the Vrathi, not soldiers but engineers and teachers. They landed near Chicago and asked for help rebuilding their command networks. Networks that kept failing because their officers could no longer trust their own judgment. Kyle worked with them, not as a former enemy but as a problem solver. He taught them how to design systems that allowed for error, for doubt, for change. Order isn't the absence of chaos, he told them. It's what you build after you accept that chaos exists. The Vrathi listened. They took notes. They asked questions. Then the Kelu arrived. Their ship was soft and organic, shaped like a leaf. They brought their young, small, trembling beings who couldn't connect to the hive mind. Lena met them in Oregon, where the forests were thick and quiet. She didn't speak their language, but she understood their fear. She sat with the young ones, not to fix them, but to be with them. She sang old human lullabies, songs full of sorrow and hope, of leaving and returning. The Kelu children calmed, not because the songs were perfect, but because they were real. Word spread. More species came. Not all had voted for Earth's enslavement, but many had stayed silent. Now they sought guidance. Earth became a place of strange pilgrimage, a planet that had refused to break and now offered healing to those who had tried to break it. The humans did not gloat. They did not demand apologies. They simply helped on their terms. No more votes, no more decrees. Every agreement was made face-to-face, voice-to-voice. Trust had to be earned, not assumed. Kyle oversaw teams that traveled to former enemy worlds. In Vrathi cities, they helped design schools where students were taught to question, not just obey. In Zenthari orbitals, they installed dissonance chambers, rooms where controlled noise helped minds stay flexible. Lena worked with linguists from a dozen species, creating new forms of communication that allowed for uncertainty, for I don't know. Eli stayed mostly on Earth, but his ideas traveled far. He wrote simple guides, how to build mental resilience, how to welcome chaos without drowning in it. They were translated into hundreds of languages. Some species called him a sage. He just called himself a teacher. Back home, Earth changed too. The experience had bound people together in ways no government ever could. Nations still existed, but borders mattered less. Resources were shared. Knowledge was open. The old hunger for power gave way to a new hunger for connection. One evening, Kyle, Lena, and Eli met on a hill outside Denver. The sky was clear. No ships, no drones, just stars. They begged for mercy, Lena said softly. Not because we hurt them, because we showed them what they lost. Eli nodded. They thought strength was control. We showed them its adaptation. Kyle looked at the horizon, and now they're learning. A message came the next week from the conquered High Council, not a decree, but a request. They wanted to form a new alliance, not one of rulers and subjects, but of equals. They asked if Earth would join. The humans met in towns, in villages, in online forums, and handwritten letters. They debated. They argued. They listened. In the end, they sent a simple reply. We will talk, but we will never be managed again. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson. Humanity's greatest power was not in its weapons or its will, but in its refusal to be defined by others. And those who had once voted to enslave Earth now knelt, not in chains, but in humility, before the very chaos they had feared. Earth did not rule them. It taught them. And in doing so, it found its place among the stars, not as a servant, not as a master, but as itself. Deep in the forests of Oregon, where the trees grew tall and the rivers ran cold, a man named Eli Grant worked in a basement that smelled of damp earth and solder. He was not a soldier. He was not a leader. He was a quiet man who once taught physics at a small college before the Concord shut down all universities. Now he spent his days tinkering with wires, crystals, and old radio parts. What he was building had no name, but it hummed with a strange kind of power. Eli had always been fascinated by how minds worked. Not just human minds, but all kinds. He studied the few alien broadcasts the Concord allowed, listening for patterns. He noticed something odd. The Vrathi spoke in precise tones like music. The Zenthari pulsed light in rhythms that matched brainwave frequencies. Even the Kelu, gentle and slow, used scent markers that triggered calm responses in their own kind. Their thoughts were ordered, predictable, built on harmony. Human minds, by contrast, were messy, jumping from idea to idea, full of noise and contradiction. That noise, Eli realized, might be their greatest weapon. He called it the resonance field. It wasn't a bomb. It didn't explode or burn. Instead, it sent out a low-frequency wave that matched the natural dissonance of human thought. To humans, it felt like a faint buzz, annoying but harmless. To aliens whose minds relied on perfect internal harmony, it was like dropping a stone into a still pond. Ripples spread. Thoughts scattered. Memories blurred. For a few minutes, they couldn't think straight. They couldn't command. They couldn't remember why they were there. Eli tested it first on a captured Vrathi drone. The moment he turned it on, the drone spun in circles, its sensors flickering. It tried to speak, but its voice cracked into nonsense. After 3 minutes, it powered down. Eli knew it worked, but he also knew it had to be used carefully. This wasn't about hurting. It was about showing the Concord that Earth could not be controlled. Not by force, not by fear, not by silence. He sent word through a trusted runner, a retired postal worker named Helen who still knew every back road in the state. She carried a small device wrapped in wax paper to a meeting point near Boise. From there, it traveled to Denver to Kyle Dawson. Kyle held the device in his palm. It was no bigger than a coffee mug with copper coils and a single red switch. He didn't understand the science, but he understood the message. This was not a weapon of war. It was a key, a way to unlock the Concord's grip without bloodshed. He contacted Lena. She met him 2 weeks later in a wheat field outside Cheyenne, where the wind drowned out all sound. She brought notes on Vrathi command structures, where their officers gathered when they communicated, how they made decisions. Together they planned the first test. They chose a small Concord outpost near Salt Lake City. It housed a dozen Vrathi and controlled drone patrols for 3 states. At midnight, under a moonless sky, 3 humans crept close. One carried the resonance device. Another carried a decoy, a broken generator they would accidentally leave behind. The third watched for patrols. Eli had set the field to last exactly 4 minutes, long enough to cause confusion, short enough to avoid permanent harm. They placed the device behind a water tank, turned the switch, and ran. Inside the outpost, the Vrathi froze. Their leader dropped his data slate. His thoughts, usually sharp as glass, turned to fog. He heard voices that weren't there, saw shadows move. He tried to call for backup, but his words came out in the wrong order. The others stumbled, bumping into walls, muttering in broken syllables. One curled into a corner, rocking back and forth. None of them fought. None of them understood what was happening. 4 minutes later, clarity returned. But the damage was done. The drones had stopped flying. The comms were silent. The humans had vanished. The Vrathi reported a system anomaly, but they were shaken. For the first time, they felt vulnerable. Word spread through the Concord fleet. Not as an attack, but as a mystery. Ships began running extra diagnostics. Officers double-checked their mental stability before shifts. Fear crept in, not of violence, but of losing control of their own minds. Lena used the confusion to her advantage. She sent new fake reports claiming the anomaly was spreading due to Earth's magnetic field, a natural phenomenon the Concord had overlooked. The Xanthari ships pulled higher into orbit, worried their crystalline minds might shatter. The Kelu requested immediate withdrawal, citing psychic instability. The Vrathi doubled their patrols, but their movements grew erratic. They no longer trusted their own senses. Eli built more devices, small ones for runners to carry, larger ones hidden in abandoned cell towers. He taught others how to make them using parts from old microwaves, car batteries, and quartz crystals mined from riverbeds. The design was simple enough that a high school student could build one, and many did. In Atlanta, a group of teens placed a resonance field under a Concord supply depot. In Sydney, fishermen dropped a waterproof version into a harbor where an alien ship docked. Each activation lasted only minutes, but each left the aliens disoriented, doubting their reality. Kyle coordinated the placements like a conductor. He didn't give orders. He asked questions. Where do they gather? When are they most confident? What do they fear most? The answers shaped the plan. They never targeted civilians, never struck at random. Every use had a purpose, to disrupt command, not life. Lena began broadcasting a new kind of message. Not in alien tongues, but in human ones. Short phrases played over old radio frequencies. Your mind is your own. They fear our noise. Stay calm. Stay clever. People heard them and felt less alone. The resistance wasn't just hiding, it was thinking. The Concord High Council demanded answers. Their scientists scanned Earth for energy spikes, radiation, anything unusual. They found nothing. The resonance field left no trace. It was invisible, silent, and unstoppable. For beings who trusted logic above all, this was terrifying. Eli watched from his basement as reports came in. A Vrathi officer in Berlin had walked into a wall, convinced it was a door. A Xanthari navigator in orbit had miscalculated a course and nearly crashed into a satellite. The Concord was unraveling, not from outside force, but from within. He thought of his students, now scattered or silent. He hoped they were safe. He hoped they understood. This wasn't about winning. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity's chaos was not weakness, it was strength. That a mind that could hold joy and grief at once, that could imagine a better world while living in a broken one, could not be tamed. Kyle stood on a hill outside Denver, holding a new device. The sky above was full of Concord ships, but they flew higher now, more cautious. He looked at the red switch. He didn't feel anger. He felt responsibility. Lena sat in her darkened office, listening to static on a shortwave radio. Somewhere in that noise was a human voice whispering hope. And Eli, in his quiet basement, turned the dial on his latest prototype. The hum grew louder. Not a threat, a warning. The conquered had come to enslave Earth. They never imagined that Earth's greatest weapon was the sound of its own unquiet mind. The conquered armada still hung in Earth's sky, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a cage with cracks. Ships that once hovered with confidence now drifted farther out. Their lights dimmer, their movements slower. The Vrathi patrols on the ground had shrunk to half their size. Officers jumped at shadows. Some refused to leave their barracks without two companions. The resonance fields had done their work, not by breaking bodies but by shaking belief. And belief, once lost, was hard to rebuild. The High Council of the Conquered called an emergency session, not on Xylos Prime this time but in orbit above Earth. They could no longer ignore the truth. Their control was slipping. Reports flooded in from every occupied zone. Command centers went silent for minutes at a time. Orders were misheard. Memories failed. Even the Zenthari, whose minds were crystalline and precise, began reporting echo thoughts, ideas that repeated endlessly, like a song stuck in the head. The Kelu begged to be reassigned. The Vrathi demanded answers their science could not give. For the first time, fear entered the Concord's voice. Not fear of weapons or armies, but fear of the unknown. They had come to manage a planet of chaos, but they had not prepared for chaos that could reach into their own minds and twist them from the inside. They sent envoys, not soldiers, but diplomats. Soft-spoken beings wrapped in flowing robes, their faces unreadable but their hands trembling slightly. They landed in what was once Geneva, at the ruins of the old United Nations building. The structure had been damaged during the early days of occupation, but humans had quietly repaired the main chamber, not for pride, but for purpose. They knew this moment would come. Kyle Dawson walked into the chamber wearing a plain gray jacket and worn boots. He carried no weapon, no badge, no title. Beside him was Lena Ruiz, her hair tied back, eyes sharp but calm. Behind them stood Eli Grant, quiet as ever, his hands tucked in his pockets. They were not leaders in the old sense. They were simply the ones who had been asked to speak. The lead envoy, a Vrathi named Kor, stepped forward. His voice, once sharp and commanding, now held a strange softness. "We come to understand," he said through a translator. "Your planet resists, but resistance brings only more control. Lay down your defiance. Return to order. We will ease your labor quotas. We will allow schools to reopen. We offer peace." Kyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke, not with anger, but with clarity. "You didn't come to offer peace. You came because you're afraid. You thought we'd break under your rules. But we didn't, and now your own minds are slipping. That's not our doing. That's yours. You voted to enslave us without ever asking who we are." Lena added, "You saw chaos and called it weakness, but chaos is how we adapt, how we survive. You built your galaxy on silence and order. We built ours on noise and questions. You can't control that." "No one can." Kor shifted his weight. His mandibles clicked once, a sign of unease. "Then what do you want?" Eli finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We want you to leave. Not in pieces, not in shame, but in peace. Pack your ships, take your drones, go home, and never vote on Earth's fate again." The envoys exchanged glances. This was not the negotiation they expected. They had prepared for demands: more food, less work, representation. Not this clean, hard line: leave or face more of what you cannot explain. They asked for time to consult the High Council. The humans agreed, but they gave a warning. If one more human is taken against their will, if one more child is scanned without consent, we will activate the resonance field across every city, every base, every ship in low orbit. Not to hurt you, but to show you what it feels like to lose your mind. The envoys left pale, even the ones who didn't have skin to pale. Back in their orbiting command vessel, the Conquered debated. Some species wanted to double down, send more troops, deploy neural suppressors, burn the resistance out. But others refused. The Zenthari said their ships could not withstand another harmonic disturbance. The Kelu declared that forcing order on a chaotic world was unnatural. Even some Vrathi admitted that their warriors were no longer steady. The vote was no longer unanimous. For the first time in centuries, the Conquered was divided. On Earth, people waited, not in fear but in readiness. They kept their radios charged. They hid extra food. They taught their children how to find clean water and how to stay quiet. But they also planted gardens. They held music nights in basements. They rebuilt what they could. They lived as if freedom was already theirs because in their hearts it was. A week passed. Then 10 days. On the 11th morning, a single Concorde ship descended, not with drones but with a white signal flare. It landed near the UN ruins. Another envoy stepped out, this time alone. He carried no armor, only a data slate. He handed it to Kyle. On the screen was a simple message. We will withdraw. All forces to depart within 30 days. Earth is no longer under Concord stewardship. Kyle read it, handed it to Lena. She nodded. Eli said nothing, but his shoulders relaxed just a little. The withdrawal began slowly. First, the enforcers left the streets. Then the drones powered down. Factories were handed back to human managers. Power grids returned to local control. The ships in orbit began to lift away one by one like birds leaving a storm. But the humans did not cheer. They watched. They remembered. They knew the Concord could change its mind. Then something unexpected happened. A Vrathi officer, the same one who had overseen Denver, approached Kyle before boarding his transport. He held out a small object, a carved stone, smooth and dark. For your silence, he said. We did not understand it. We still do not. But we respect it. Kyle took it. Tell your people this, he said. Earth doesn't want your fear. But if you ever come back as equals, not masters, you'll find a seat at our table. The officer bowed slightly, a gesture not in any Vrathi protocol, and walked away. As the last ship cleared the atmosphere, a strange quiet settled over the planet. Not the silence of occupation, but the silence of breath held and then released. People stepped outside. They looked up. The sky was empty. Just blue, just stars, just theirs. Lena stood on a rooftop in Austin, listening to the wind. For the first time in months, there was no hum from alien engines. Only birds. Only life. Kyle walked through Denver, past the community garden, past the kids playing with a handmade kite. Someone offered him bread. He took it and smiled. Eli returned to his basement in Oregon. He didn't shut off the resonance field. He kept it ready. Not as a threat, but as a promise. Earth would never be taken again. The Concorde had come with votes and ships and certainty. They left with questions and silence and doubt. And humanity, once voted into slavery, now stood alone under its own sky. Not as victors, but as survivors. And that was enough.